Hey everyone, it's Connor from Koyfin here. This week we released a highly requested feature, the yield curve chart. And today I'm going to highlight that as well as discuss how to use it and why it's useful. Before we start, I just want to highlight the fact that you can submit feature requests up here in the feedback button in the top right-hand corner of your screen. We guide a lot of our product roadmap on these feature requests, and it's also a place for you to ask questions, submit issues, and see what we're working on. A yield curve chart is a way to visualize the relationship between the interest rates or yields of bonds, typically government bonds, across a spectrum of different maturities or tenors. So they're typically used for government bonds of maturities between 1 month and 30 years. In Koyfin, we also added the 0 month, which represents the central bank policy rate of the respective country that you're looking at. So right now, at the time of recording, the Federal Reserve rate is 5.5%, and then we have all of the government bond rates along this curve. Typically in a yield curve, the tenors or maturities are presented along the x-axis, which you can see here, and the yield is along the y-axis. So in terms of what the yield curve is used for, we'll get into that in just a moment, but at a high level, it gives you a different perspective on something that might otherwise be difficult to read. So let's show you an example of that. Here is a historical graph inside of Koyfin, and all I've done is plotted the time series of each of those yields that I just showed you in that yield curve for the United States. And if I change that time period to 10 years, we can see the overall trend of yields across various maturities. But as far as the relationship between those specific yields goes, it's harder to decipher. So what the yield curve does is, and I can show you this. So let's grab a vertical line and let's pop it here on October 24th, 2023. Now imagine this horizontal line strikes through the chart. It's going to come into contact with one data point from each of these tenors, and that represents the yield on this date. What the yield curve chart does is then transposes that data so that it's presented across an x-axis and it's a bit easier to read. There's several ways of interpreting a yield curve chart. The three most common are normal, inverted, and flat. And to illustrate this, I'm going to go ahead and add another yield curve here for the United States, and we're going to take this date back to before the pandemic. So what you can now see here is we have the most recent yield curve here on the top, and then we have the roughly same date 4 years ago. One is upward sloping and the other one is downward sloping. So this bottom yield curve here is what we would call a normal yield curve, where the yields of the shorter term bonds tend to be lower, and then they increase as you get towards the longer tenors. This yield curve at the top is what we call an inverted yield curve, which is just the reverse of that. So a downward sloping curve where the shorter term bonds have higher yields. Now in Koyfin, you can plot yield curves of the same country over different periods, or you could also come in here and add other yield curves to the same chart. Let's take Japan, and we'll remove this 2020. So now we have the most up-to-date yield curve for Japan, as well as the United States. We'll present that to you in the chart where you can turn the labels on and off with this button here. You can turn the data on and off with this button. You can change your grid settings, and you can also change the styling of the graph line itself. So if I want this orange line here for Japan to be thick, I can do so. I can make it dashed if I want as well. And I can also change the date, duplicate, and delete from this dialog box as well. As you might have seen, you can change the sizing of each of these components here as well with this little drag and drop item. And you can also download this data or share it, with the option, like you have everywhere else in Koyfin, to add logos and customize this chart a little bit more. There are other ways already in Koyfin to express relationships between yield curves. If I jump over to this dashboard here, which is yield spreads, we show you the relationship between various government bond yields. This is the US 10-year to 2-year. And this curve is shared quite often because it has a quote unquote 100% hit rate for the forecasting of recessions. So if I click this hyperlink and pull this into a chart here and take this over a longer time period, We can see here there's various periods throughout history when this curve has inverted or became negative. And right now we're currently in one. Here's another one from 2020. And then here's the one that we're currently in, which has been going since 2022. With the inversion that occurred in 2019, this preceded the pandemic of 2022 by about 8 months. Some argue that the recession which followed, as ephemeral as it might have been, was an anomaly, and that there was no way a yield curve could have forecast a pandemic. That without the pandemic, we have no way of knowing if a recession would have occurred otherwise. I think that's just the reality of life. We'll never know what that outcome would have been. So I imagine that this particular yield curve will always have an asterisk attached to it. As for the current inversion, which has been ongoing since the first quarter of 2022, with no recession yet to be unearthed, only time will tell. So back to the yield curve, this is basically a new way of looking at the data that we already presented inside of Koyfin. It was a fun project to build, and we look forward to hearing how you think we could improve it. And that just about does it for this video. As always, you can reach out to us in the comments section below. Our help desk is help@koyfin.com. We are at Koyfin Charts over on Twitter and all of the other social medias. Until next time, thank you.